You are able to unmute yourself as we make our way through, but once more, I would ask that unless it is urgent, pressing, some technical issue, that you not, just for the sake of the recording. If questions come up, please feel free to type them in the chat. Happy to address them as we make our way through. We will also have plenty of time at the end to dig in. So with that, let's go ahead and get started because there is quite a bit to get through. Now, a little bit of background about me, just so you have a sense of the theoretical take that I bring to this. I always find it's helpful to make this explicit so that you can question and pick apart the assumptions I make, rather than take it all as guru gospel, anything like that. So my background is in research in biological systems. I worked for a brief period of time at the United States Environmental Protection Agency, looking at the intersection of environmental factors and epidemiological factors. Basically, what about the environment makes us sick? And that was good fun for a while, but I ran screaming for the hills after the bureaucracy wore me down. And then I developed a bit of a reputation for cross-pollination between the natural movement communities and the embodiment communities through the practice of ecosomatics, which, for those who aren't familiar, is essentially body-mind plus. It's body-mind looking at the environment as a key factor for understanding that. So this intersection of the physical stuff, the psychological stuff, and the ecological stuff. And of course, now many of you know that I'm a current doctoral student in clinical psychology, focusing on depth psychology and its intersection with embodied practices. So hopefully that gives you a good lay of the land as to the vantage point that I have. It is not the way to examine posture, but I find that it's a very helpful way, and that actually we can make a lot of progress with this cross-disciplinary lens. But that's enough about me, because we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about posture. Yeah. Now, posture is a funny word, and we might think that opposed by any other name might smell as sweet. But I thought if we're going to take a look at posture, it's worth examining where the word comes from, because that alone is indicative of many of the problems that we encounter in terms of our posture. There is, in fact, a sort of unconscious to the very words that we use, and something creeps into the way that we think quite often, unless we pick these things apart and examine them. So the word posture, the word that we know and love and loathe today, comes from a Latin word meaning to put, or to place, or to set. Now, that should get us a little curious, because we might then wonder, well, if we put things in a certain place, why the hell don't they stay where we put them? Why don't they remain in place? So I'd like to start you off with a bit of a practice to consider this. Would you please come to stand wherever you are, if that's available to you? If not, you're welcome to stay seated as well. And let's take a look at this putting of yourself, this placing of yourself, this setting of yourself. We have even now put you in a particular position. The challenge is that you're not going to stay there. And we can wonder why. So as you stand here, take a moment to get a sense of your uprightness without necessarily changing anything. I would encourage you to suspend the habit of fixing yourself for a moment. And simply take stock of what you're aware of now, how tall you feel, the sense of spaciousness of the left and right sides of the room, the distance you have available in front of you and behind you, where, for example, it feels that gravity is winning today. And you could Assign a number to yourself. We love numbers, yeah? They help us pin things down. On a scale of 0 to 10, you might gauge for yourself the quality of your posture here. 10 being unparalleled, magnificent, you're awestruck at your sense of uprightness. 0 being you're actually probably on the floor. Let's say no one ought to be a 0 today, but you could be pretty close. Now, the other thing that I'd like to direct your attention towards is the fact that even in this stationary position, you are in fact shifting. You've put yourself in a position. You've placed yourself here. You've set yourself up, and yet you do not remain stationary. Now, these little bits of movement that you might be keying into here, these are profoundly important for us if we want to make an easier time for ourselves when it comes to our posture. And as we continue on through this presentation, I'm going to help you develop a little better familiarity with this language of the body. Help you figure out how you can amplify some of this natural capacity for movement. But at the start, I wanted you to have this baseline sense. So, feel free to shake that off. Feel free to wiggle yourself around, and we'll come on back and carry on. This is something that, again, you have many opportunities to check in with as we continue. Now, when we think about putting, placing, setting, when we think about the root of the word posture, it seems to me that what we're talking about really is our relationship to the environment. It's our situatedness. It's where we're placed and the capacity that we have to engage with the world around us in that sense. Now, the shape of our posture, the form we take when we're sitting, standing, this is in fact informed by our history and the habits we've used to cope with our surroundings. Now, I say habits in the big picture sense. Our shape that we take, whether it's slumped over, whether it's braced upright, whether it's anything in between, it's shaped by the ongoing behaviors we've engaged in across time in order to make sense of the world around us, in order to withstand all of the stuff we're up against. Now, this includes this surroundings bit, just so you have a sense of where we're going to go with this. This includes both the physical elements of the environment and the psychological. And for the human animal, our survival depends on our ability to position ourselves relative to both. We have to be able to move through the environment, and we have to be able to relate to other critters moving through the environment as well. And for people in particular, it's more important that we relate to those other critters than that we move. And our survival has a lot more riding on other people, on the relationships we have with them, than our ability to move. But the two together give us a lot easier time making our way through life. Now, when I think about what's going on in a human body, if someone comes to work with me as a client, if whatever the case is, someone presents a question, I think in terms of 3 intersecting rings. We might think of these as 3 rings woven together. We have this environmental factor, the situations a person finds themselves in day to day, the places and spaces they spend their time, all of which come together and influence them, as I mentioned, in varying ways. We have the psyche, the psychological factor, our mental and emotional worlds, our intellectual life wrapped up in that. And we have the soma, this living body, this adapting body, this body that changes over time. And each of these little intersections is a whole discipline in and of itself. We're not going to get into the entirety of this today. That would be a very high level view. Yeah. But we can begin to touch on each of these. And at the start, you have a sense of this interaction of the 3, this sense of your uprightness, your readiness to engage in the environment. Yeah. And we'll continue to tinker with this as we make our way through. But I just wanted to give you a visual image because we are going to touch on each of these intersections as we make our way through. And for the time being, you might have a reference point to think, how does my body respond to the environment? How do I psychologically respond to the environment? How do I psychologically respond to my body? And how does my body respond to what's taking place through the psyche? No small thing. Now, the quality of our movement, the quality of our postural organization as well, is constituted. It's made up of our ability to maintain our sense of security in these relationships. When we think posture and we think improving the way that we move, we ought to keep an ear listening for our sense of security to where we feel that we are at risk. That helps us make a lot of sense out of what the body is experiencing. Now, to really anchor this in for you, to put it in practical terms, think of what you do when you're hurt. If you stub your toe, what do? You brace, right? If you touch a hot stove, you retract and clench, you engage musculature in a protective response, yeah? And what do you do when you're anxious? What have you been doing for the last year straight? I know I've been doing a lot of, oh God, okay, it's another day, it's another whatever, it's on it. But this tensing, this bracing, this clenching, this is how we maintain our sense of security. This is what we do when we feel our security has been compromised. We contract our musculature. And quite simply, when you contract a muscle, if you flex your bicep right now, you flex and bend your arm, what you'll notice is that the bicep shortens. So if we're making our way through the world and we have this sense that we are continually at risk, we're continually shortening ourselves. We're continually condensing into ourselves. So, a practice to unclench some of this, to lengthen some of ourselves. If it's possible for you now, could you make your way to lie on your back on the ground? If that is not possible, please stay in a seated position. If you deal with vertigo, if you have any sort of neurological challenge that you're faced with, if the ground just doesn't seem like a friendly place today, it's all good. You are, as we make our way through this, the boss when it comes to these practices. But if it's available, you can make your way down to the ground. Now, in the first moment of lying on your back on the ground, something significant happens within the body. You enter into a different relationship to support. Whereas before, you had the demand to maintain your uprightness. You were forced to engage certain muscles in order to stay upright. In this position, it's not so necessary. In fact, as you lie on the back, there is a very bare minimum amount of muscular activity required to keep you going in this case. Now, as you lie on the ground, you'll notice moment by moment that other parts of yourself perhaps get that hint too. Other parts of yourself begin to realize the support available behind you in this case. And in the presence of that support, it's not necessary to maintain a muscular contraction. So notice, if you would, the parts of yourself where it is clearest that you're in contact with the ground behind you. Notice in particular where you feel a sense of weight. That sense of weight can connect us to the ground. That sense of weight can connect us to our support. You might imagine if we were going to dip you in paint and place you on a canvas, that you would make a certain work of art, that paint would be clearest and paintiest, not the most technical way to put it, yeah, but the paint would be very apparent in certain parts of the canvas, and in certain other parts, not quite so much. This can clue you into what parts of yourself are in contact with the ground. Now, some of you, as you lie on the ground, have your legs lengthened away from you, and others of you have your legs bent so that the feet are standing. We can think that there's a lot wrapped up in that preference, that you chose the configuration you did, consciously or not, for a particular reason. So would you take a moment and explore that other variation? If you have your legs lengthened, would you bend the legs? And if you had the legs bent, would you lengthen them? And notice, even in that small change, what's different about the way that your back makes contact with the ground? What's different about the pattern of tension throughout the body? Now you could slowly move back and forth between those two shapes if you'd like. You can hone in on your attention of what you notice. But what you're looking for here is the sense of what's different. What you're looking for here is a sense of what's preferable to you. You may find that, well, yeah, for good reason I went to the other one. There's a reason I started out there. I don't want to do that other thing. And that's fine. Or you may surprise yourself and find, well, actually, yeah, that other variation's a bit more comfortable. Why didn't I do that in the first place? In whichever variation is most comfortable, would you make the first small movement to lift your head as if you were going to look down in the direction of your toes? Now notice, I said the first small movement as if to look toward your toes, and so many people have just cranked the neck upright. It's okay, we have our habits. But would you repeat this a few times until you have the sense of the first moment where you're aware of the weight of the head? That's what we're really looking to investigate here. How heavy is the head? And how far away from the ground do you need to move before you get a sense of, wow, the head is freaking heavy? The head is massive. When do you notice that? You may even have a sense of how heavy the head is before it leaves contact with the ground. There's a way that you can almost lift the skull away from the ground, but the skin or the hair along the back of the head may still be in contact with the ground. Now, if you would, please interlace your fingers together in front of you. If you bring your hands in front and interlace your fingers, you can look at them. You can see the palms of the hand. Then would you bring those interlaced fingers behind your head? Now, in doing so, you had to lift your head away from the ground. So can you take a few moments here to let your head settle back in, to let your head reclaim that sense of weightiness? You might find it helpful in pursuit of this to point your elbows in the direction of the ceiling, forwards in space. That may change something about the shape of the back behind you that lets you settle into the position a bit more. Slowly now, would you lift your elbows a little forward so that you carry the head in the cradle of the hands, and then lower back down toward the ground? And begin to investigate as you take the head away from the ground like this, where is it that you get heavy? Where is it that you actually come into the ground more, to come away from the ground with the head? There's a relationship of counterbalance here. Something goes up, something goes down, something gets heavy, something gets light. And if you bring your elbows forward so that the head is away from the ground and you pause there, think, what would you have to do? How would you rearrange yourself if you knew you were going to hold this position for another 30 seconds? Where would you sink more into the ground to make this easier for yourself? What tension is necessary to give you this sense of lift? And what tension isn't? Does the position of the legs matter here? Now, I'm not going to ask you to put yourself through some grueling paces. Go ahead and lower the head down again. Bring your arms down by your side. And once more, without anything riding on the outcome, more out of a sense of curiosity, if you lift your head once more as if to look down toward your toes, is there some small change in the sense of weight in the head? In the sense of connection it has to the rest of the body? No, we haven't done much. I don't expect much yet, but perhaps it gets you curious. Now, when you're ready, please take your time, but will you come back up to a seated position? And we'll continue on from here. Now, unfortunately, we have enough people that we can't go through and round table this quite so much, but if you can think to yourself about how you would describe what you noticed, if you would put a name to the sense of uprightness or posture that you have now, you can capture that feeling in words. And that's a very useful thing, as we'll come back to moving forward. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to begin with this interaction of soma and environment, the body and the world around us. Now that we've had this firsthand sense of what it's like to be more and less secure with ourselves, this can make a bit more sense. Now, as I mentioned, the primary physical demand to which we're subject is gravity. When it comes to posture, when it comes to making sense of this, we've got to think in terms of our relationship to gravity. I mentioned when you were standing up before where it seems that gravity is winning. And when gravity is winning, we are forced to tense and brace and maintain and hold if we're going to stay upright. But even in the midst of that ever-present downward pull, we claim a pretty fortunate inheritance. Phileas there is a good demonstration of how much work has gone into us over countless millennia to make sure that we can actually navigate the field of gravity. The skeleton is in fact a necessary element in terrestrial animals beyond a certain size. If you want to walk around on land, you can get by up to a certain size without needing a skeleton. But if you're going to be big, as humans tend to be, you need a skeleton for support. You're going to be hard-pressed to find an animal above a certain size and above a certain level of neurological complexity that doesn't have a skeleton. And again, that should make us wonder. Now, the skeleton really is beautifully designed to resist that compressive force of gravity. If gravity is always pulling in a particular direction, it's not going to change on us. Yeah, it's a pretty steady force. We can wonder about this upright shape and think that's no accident. It's not accidental that that's the shape we've taken across time in dealing with gravity. Gravity is a pretty steady variable, and that is actually beautifully well equipped to deal with gravity. Now, in the proper alignment, if we have a sense of skeletal support, there is minimal energy expenditure required. I mentioned minimal need for the muscles to contract and engage. So if the skeleton is able to support us, that leaves our muscles free for movement. And this is of the utmost importance for us. What I find again and again, some of our movement as metaphor trainees here, we were just talking about this the other day. If the skeleton is supporting us, the limbs are free to do just about anything they want, again, with very minimal muscular effort. There is some muscular effort required, but it is not a lot. If you think back to when you were standing upright, there was some muscular effort required to help you balance, catch your balance, readjust. But you didn't need to stand upright and brace your core and squeeze your glutes and get your shoulders in place. There wasn't a need for all of that, necessarily. Now, I mentioned this leaves the muscles free for movement. Not all of the muscles, because some, again, are required for maintenance of the upright position. You actually likely want the musculature around your eyelids to be engaged if you're going to be upright and moving through the world. Moving through the world with closed eyes is a little problematic. You want some of the musculature around your jaw to be engaged, because moving through life slack-jawed is a bit of a tricky proposition for us. We want some musculature along the back side of ourselves to be engaged, because if it weren't, we would topple forward. However, as I mentioned, it is far less that's needed than we often suspect, and then we often acclimate ourselves to. So we're going to work more and more through this presentation. And God, I wish we had just 6 hours, but we're going to work to the degree we could to key into that sense of skeletal support. But not to put too fine a pin on it, I'll say again that if you want to move well and you want to improve your posture, you must become keenly aware of your relationship to support. You must begin to develop this sense of skeletal awareness within that pull of gravity. Now, we have a practice for this as well. Some of you will be familiar with the grains of sand idea. It's a way to help us tune into that sense. But for a moment, would you collapse into yourself a bit? Would you sort of forget that you have a skeleton and just kind of sink into yourself some? Now, as you collapse into yourself this way, as you embody the bag of meat idea of the body, it's not the most functional way to be. Yeah. If you really just sink and give up into yourself, how ready do you feel to open that letter from the IRS that showed up? How ready do you feel to check the news at this point? How ready do you feel for Monday morning and another work week and another whatever bit of headline? Like, this collapse is not a great place for us to be psychologically. You also likely get a sense that physically, not so comfortable. It's not a good thing I've asked you to do here for a long period of time. People are already kind of shaking out of the position. It's all good to want to do that. That's a sign of life. Now, what many of us will do when we find ourselves in this collapsed state, especially if we feel the need, like we've got to pay attention somehow, we'll prop ourselves upright. I'll lean over onto an arm here, I can adjust here. I can lean over onto an arm. I can put my chin on my hand. I can do all of these things to really to prop myself up. It's like I stick a bony segment and some connective tissue up under me, and I'm just hanging in there in this case. So if you prop yourself up, you might get a sense that this is a little more functional. This gets me here a little bit more, but it's still not quite optimal. It's not precisely where I'd like to be. Now, we can correct this because, of course, if I'm collapsed into myself or propping up, some feisty posture person might come along and say, sit up straight, shoulders down and back. And so what do I do in that case? If I want proper posture, I sit up straight, I pull my shoulders down and back, I tuck my chin, I exert muscular effort to pull myself up and out of that position, right? You might try that a couple of times. You could collapse into yourself and then do the thing you do when you think about proper posture, whatever that thing is. But it's probably a voluntary engagement of some musculature, And you know as well as I do that the second you stop thinking about that, the second you're distracted, yeah, we know this. There's a silly SNL sketch at this point, Dr. We Notice. It just came to mind. Regardless, there's a better alternative for us than exerting more force. The world is forceful enough. There are enough things to sap our effort and energy and attention. Posture ought not be one of them. So if you collapse into yourself for a moment, I'd like to help you find a little better way out. From this place of sinking into yourself, notice that you are not separate from the environment here. You're not absent of contact. You actually make physical contact with the environment in a couple of places. Now, maybe it's the chair, maybe it's the floor, maybe it's whatever part is underneath of you. But if you sense that connection to the support underneath of you, we're going to aim our attention at that point. Now, this practice is something called yielding. It's a little different than hoisting ourselves up and out of this collapse. We're actually going to build this alignment from the ground up. Now, imagine, if you would, that your body is something like an hourglass full of sand. If you think of those places where you contact the ground and pour more grains of sand into those places, see if you can let yourself get heavier and heavier. Pour grain by grain by grain into those points of contact. Your only intention here is down. But of course, you've seen how sand falls in an hourglass. You've seen how it begins to pile up and spread its base out. If you imagine something similar happening through you, sinking more into those points of contact, widening your base out around you in 360 degrees. If you imagine that as the grains of sand pile more and more, you actually get a little taller and taller. You may now have the sense that without much muscular effort, you've actually built yourself out of that position. without needing to pull or contract or shrink anywhere within you. You may have found a way to take up a bit more space, to find a bit more uprightness, without the toil of muscular contraction. Now, you're not limp and passive here, right? There's a quality of presence, I would imagine, a sort of alertness, not of vigilance necessarily, but a sense of, well, here I am now. This sense, I really want to make sure you hear this. This sense is always available to you. This quality of yielding is always possible. It takes a movement of our attention. It takes a movement of our awareness, but it doesn't take much effort. It takes the floor and your attention. Now, we have much more to explore. I encourage you not to clutch this sense of yielding, because the moment we clutch and hold on to the thing, what do? I shorten, I tense, I brace. Don't treat it as precious. You're going to lose it. Know that. You're going to lose it at some point, but you can regain it. And it's that regaining of that sense that is the most important thing. Again, we don't put in place and set ourselves in a fixed posture. You're not a corpse. You're alive. So you might slip out of it. You might have the old habit of pulling yourself up, come back in, but then you can perhaps let that go and think, can I build this from the ground up rather than pulling myself out of that slump? We habituate ourselves to more work than is necessary. We get used to strain. We train ourselves to live with a sense of effort. But we can learn our way out of that. Now, it's worth mentioning that physically speaking, we're running on an old model. This right here, this is a classic. This is that old time religion. We're running on old, way back sort of stuff. Now, the environment now is not the same as the environment then. If we're thinking in terms of our evolutionary heritage here, we're living in very different contexts. And you simply need to know that, because it's likely that you're holding yourself to a standard that is a bit in the order of impossibility. This configuration, as beautifully designed as it is to deal with the force of gravity, it developed in a context of frequent movement in varying environmental circumstances. So we are actually geared in many ways for frequent varied movement. And without that, we deal with consequences. Now, the downside is that there's no way to avoid this. If we do not move, there will be consequences. And that can seem like a bit of a bummer. It's a bit like finding out that Santa isn't real. We simply have to move. And yet the upside is that there is plenty we can do about it. Now, if you think in terms of those three rings, the environment, the soma, the psyche here, if we want to tune up our relationship between soma and environment, get our body and environment working a little better, we want to think in terms of habits and habitat. Because again, the places and spaces we spend our time influence the shape of our body, the function and form of our body as well. And there are very simple things we can do. In fact, the simpler, the better. Now, for many of the people here, these are not going to be new things. But it's worth reiterating that A bit of time spent on the floor each day, out of the shape of a chair, is a useful self-tuner for the body. It's not comfortable, generally speaking, to maintain one shape while sitting on the floor. The floor starts to let you know that you're compressing a bit too much there, or you really are like cutting off oxygen to those cells in the shin there. You need to move that around. So when we sit on the floor, as I do all day, every day at the desk here, we're forced into consistent movements. These little changes are changing the relationship of every joint in the body here. Now, you may find if you begin a floor sitting practice that discomfort is actually a little unmanageable at the start, in which case it is totally fine to get a little bit of a cushion underneath of you. If finding your way down to the ground is problematic, you can, so to speak, bring the ground up to you and support yourself that way. And again, if you have ears to hear it, we're talking about support. We're talking about finding support within these varied positions. Now, even if I bring that cushion up, I can have a leg long, I can have a leg to the side, I can have both legs long. And each of these little shifts that now that you're looking out for it, you'll see me kind of constantly making these little changes. Again, each is enlivening a certain part of the body. Each is waking up neurological connections. It's getting the conversation started within the body. And each is providing a mechanical stimulus for the joints. Each is a bit like a multivitamin for the joints in terms of making little movements that start to oxygenate and bring nutrients to those particular cells in that little corner that maybe you haven't moved in quite a while. Again, it's not comfortable the first week or so that a person gets into it, but around week 2, I see people take off with it. It's a very consistent, very reliable practice. And I just want to give you at least some concrete do this and life will get better thing. Now, another variation of this that goes a long way in terms of improving our uprightness, I think of it as the floor sitting of the upper body. Because again, many people will note that our historical context, our ancestral context, involved a lot of doing stuff with our arms that we don't get to do much day to day, yeah? Typically, our day to day at this point is a bit of this and a bit of this. Maybe you're reaching up, maybe you're opening a door, but not a whole lot of three-dimensional movement, yeah? So if you would like to open up some space in the shoulders and neck, the ribs, the upper spine, this is a phenomenal way to do it. And it's quite simple. You look around for any sturdy surface you could get a hold of, and you grab that thing, like a door jamb, a railing, a tree branch, your spouse or partner, the car door handle, anything that can support some weight, you hold that and you lean away from it. Now, in doing that, I introduce a very different sort of stimulus to the arms than they typically get. Again, this may seem simple to some people. This may seem totally bizarre to other people. I don't know where you are on the spectrum of, I don't know how weird you are day to day, but I know I'm pretty weird. So you grab a hold of a thing and you lean yourself away from it. And what you've done is created an anchor point. You don't lose that hold, but then you can move yourself around that position. And if you spend 30, 45 seconds just wiggling, like for God's sake, just hold on to that and wiggle around some, you're going to create an incredible amount of space through the upper body. This is one of those things where I always feel a little silly recommending it. Like this and floor sitting, it's like, it's so simple, but I mean, really, that's the best I can come up with. But these things work reliably and consistently. They introduce the mechanical stimulus. If we just think of our body as a mechanical system, these introduce a profoundly different mechanical stimulus than the ones we usually get. And as such, the body adapts to those stimuli. So, very simple bread and butter practices for you. If you have questions about this, we can address them toward the end. But I think for most people, it's within the realm of comfort. Now, the other third thing, if we just think back in terms of basic human stuff, we don't walk enough. We don't get enough sustained locomotion. This structure here, Phileas, he is a perfectly designed system for bipedal locomotion. The fact that his center of gravity is here and his point of contact is down there, the fact that the head is way up there relative to the feet, I could just tip him forward and he would go. Now, he would need muscles and connective tissues in order to continue him going. But if I just carry myself forward, I'm ready to go in that sense. So I would encourage you, I would plead, I am down on my knees begging that you go for a walk every now and then, if you don't already. Again, I hope this is remedial sort of stuff, but it's worth mentioning that the other main difference is that ancestrally, humans weren't walking around on flat floors. They were walking around barefoot on varied terrain. Now, that is not obvious, and it's not something we can overlook. Because those little movements that the foot has to make adapting, even just to standing on the grass, those are waking up all the little connections within the architecture of the foot. You got to think that the foot has 33 separate joints in it. Take a look down at your foot right now. Let's have a moment just to marvel at the foot. There are 33 separate joints within that thing. Does it look, as you look at your foot, does it look like there are 33 joints, or does it look like a hunk of meat at the end of your leg? And it's okay. I mean, I don't mean to be so cavalier about it, but truly, when we spend our lives on flat floors, in shoes all day, every day, our system suffers. Each of those little variations in the position of the joints within the foot can ripple all the way up through the low back, can ripple all the way up to the neck. If we have a dynamic foot, we have a dynamic body. So stand, walk, run, jog, skip, do all of that on varied terrain, and your body will change. It will. These, I think, are the three fundamentals of a natural movement practice. And given that my background is in the natural movement world, I have to put a plug for you as a human animal. You can be a pretty good human animal just doing these things. The floor sitting, do it while you're checking your email. Do it while you're watching Netflix. 3D hanging, do it when you take a break from checking your email for 30 seconds. Going for a walk, maybe 5 minutes. This is tiny, tiny amounts of the day, but these things can compound in profound ways. Carrying on. This is the tricky part for many people. And it's the relationship of our posture as sort of a tuning fork for our psychological environment, so to speak. As I mentioned, relating to gravity and relating to the other, these are the two primary demands that shape us. Our relationships to the other let us know what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. Our relationships to the other are the things that say, sit still, sit up, pay attention, be good, obey. Now that sounds dramatic, but these are the things we had to learn to do in our youth. We, for our survival, had to learn to play the game of our parents, of our culture. Now, most of us live in a culture that is anti-movement. It is actually not acceptable to move in pleasurable ways. We're allowed to move if it feels like work. We're allowed to work out. We glorify that, but moving in ways that are inherently pleasurable, typically that gets you on the fringe of society pretty quick. Now, we're a bunch of fringe weirdos who do ecstatic dance and wiggle around and all of this stuff, I'm sure, but it's worth knowing that in the background, this is the broader context we live in. This does influence the way that we carry ourselves. Now, posture is a communicative phenomenon. When we think about how we relate to other people, we communicate. We share something. We send messages back and forth, yeah? Now, some of these messages are what's known as digital information. Not to get too technical with you here, but digital is very specific stuff. There's a reason I'm using words on the screen and speaking to you rather than an interpretive dance here. That would make for a very different postural workshop, although maybe we could have a part 2. I'd be game. We could try it out. But gesture and posture, these things fall in the realm of analog information. So whereas digital, again, is very specific, it's either this or it's not that. 0, 1, yes, no, this, that. Analog is a little more in between. It's a little more fluid. It's used to designate a continuum of sorts. And what's communicated here through posture, through analog information, is a pattern of relating. If I went through this whole presentation like this, I communicate something to you. Yeah. This gives you a different sense of me. I mean, by God, think if I showed up to teach the posture workshop and I was speaking to you like this the whole time. Actually, even better if I were down here looking up to you. That communicates something, yeah? Now, we could put our own different words to this. Some people might call this meek. Some people might call this submissive. Some people might call this lacking confidence. Some people might call this a little childish. Some people might call this any number of things. What matters is what your association is to this. Now, if I were teaching the whole workshop like this would be a little different attitude as well. Yeah, this changes my spatial relationship to my surroundings. This has me looking down on you, so to speak. This shape that I make communicates something too. This is we have an international audience. This is the American way. Yeah, like, here I am, motherfucker, look out. This is the American dream embodied. Now, it's horrible. It's uncomfortable. I don't like that. Now, there's an in-between place. And if you think back, because it's not simply a matter of having the concepts. If you go through that grains of sand idea for yourself right here, once more, would you think about your base of support? And think about pouring yourself into that base of support. Think about the grains of sand piling outward and upward. You know, that beautiful conical shape that they just make of their own accord. It's natural design. Something beautiful to that. And if you think about a biological equivalent of that within you now, what does this shape say to the world around you? What does this shape say to you about the world around you? It's not obvious. I have no idea the thoughts going through your head, the associations you make to this, but this is psychologically rich terrain. This is worth us knowing as well. When it comes to the psyche, we are at this point looking at the intersection of psyche and environment and what that means for posture. If we do not map it through speech, it will be mapped through symptom. This is sort of the rule of depth psychology. If we don't put it into words, spoken, written, whatever the case is, maybe you don't have someone to talk to, but you can write these things down. You can get it out of you and onto something. You can create some space. If it is not put into word deliberately, whew, it's going to be communicated. It's going to be mapped somehow. And generally, the way that these things map is through our flesh. If it's not through our words, it's through our flesh. As I mentioned, this shape communicates something. This is not merely biomechanics. It's not merely psychological either. It's a little bit of both. That's what makes this such a tricky thing is we're psyche, we're soma, we're flesh, it's all wrapped up in there. So this isn't just this or just that. If you take nothing else away from this, I hope that you take that. But this communicates something that perhaps I haven't found the words yet to say. Perhaps the thought of that has been intolerable in some way. Likewise, this communicates something that I've not yet found a way to say. So, there are some questions we can ask to help clue us into the psychological playing out of our posture. As I mentioned in the start, there's a sense of what do you notice? When you were standing upright at the very beginning, there was a sense of what's obvious to you? What do you notice about your sense of uprightness, about where gravity is winning, about the space to the right and the left, the front and the back, your willingness to engage in the world? What do you notice taking place through the body? Now, the next question is how? When we know what and we know how, we have a say in things. So the what might be tension. My back is tense. How? How is it tensing? If you can really tune in and develop a sense of how the musculature of the back is tensing, well, then you're able to, at the very least, stop that tensing. Now, it can take some time and some practice, some familiarity with that language of the body, but if you know what and you know how, you have a choice. The third question here is sort of two-part. Where is support? And you'll notice it's been struck through. Where is there not support? I will tell you this, the tense parts of yourself are the parts of yourself that are begging for support. If you make your way to the end of the day and you find that your back is screaming at you, what is it screaming? Now, there's a game we can play to start to get these things in motion. And I would encourage you to think of it as a game. This can feel like very intimate territory for people because, again, we're communicating something through our shape. But as a general rule of thumb, if you tune into a sense of what you notice right here and right now, where you notice tension, where you notice constriction, where you notice kind of a blocking, a numbing, a deadening, a dampening, where you notice those things, there is likely a cultural tendency you have to say, that's tense. It hurts. My shoulder is ... This is a tendency that all of us, for the most part, grow up with, to distance ourselves from our embodied experience, to create an it or an other out of the body. So you can play with that. You can get this in motion by turning the its into I's, rather than say, for example, my back aches. You might try on for size something like I ache. And you say that, you say it like dropping a pebble in a pond and seeing what ripples out. I ache. Does that seem true? Is there some other thought that comes to mind after that? It's I ache with a ... the ellipsis. It's the open-ended sort of wondering. Now, the other thing you can do here is you can see if there's a way to turn the nouns into verbs. And I say nouns, but often it could be adjectives as well. If I say that I ache, or I'm achy, or I'm tense, what's it like to turn this into one of those ing verbs? I'm aching. I'm tensing. I'm collapsing. I'm giving up. We can begin to unravel, and this truly, I don't know where it could take you. It takes each of us in different directions, but this is like the thread through the labyrinth. This is how we navigate this maze, is just by speaking the thing and seeing what, if anything, ripples out. Now, for some people, maybe this isn't your cup of tea. For other people, maybe this opens the freaking floodgates. I don't know. But I want to give you access to many different ways of looking at this postural phenomenon. Now, I'd like to raise the stakes for us and talk about poor posture and the heat death of the universe. Some of you know I have the occasional flair for the dramatic, but this really is worth us considering. Gravity pulls us ever downward. Yeah, gravity doesn't let up. It lets down. It pulls down, but it does not cease. And the universe tends ever toward undifferentiatedness. We know that entropy, that measure of disorder, theoretically speaking, it's always on the rise. All of the energy that's ever used and consumed, it's transformed into heat energy. And the thinking is, at the big end of things, it's just heat. It's just sameness. There's no way to tell this from that. It's just disorder. That's the thought. Now, we're going to be dead long before then. Phew, that would be a challenge. But I say this because there is an inexorable pull toward this undifferentiatedness, towards you being a blob on the floor, towards things getting to be in a mess and a muddle, into a just disorder. We know where things tend to go. Now, why do we care? Because life is that which sustains itself. Life is that process. It's like it sends the middle finger toward that entropic disorder, yeah? Life is the thing that persists longer than we think it should. The fact that you're here paying attention right now it's mind-boggling. The fact that you exist, frankly, is something of a miracle. The fact that you're anything other than madness and suffering and pain and blurring of yourself into whatever substances are at hand, like, that's something. There is something vital in you. I don't know what to say beyond that, other than there is something vital in you that resists this downward pull, that resists this disordering. And life, it sustains itself through movement. Movement is the means and the end. It's the way we sustain, and it's for the sake of what we sustain. It's so that we can continue moving. So I say this, I end on this somewhat dramatic note to raise the stakes for you a little bit. And again, to say that movement is, in many ways, it's a luxury. In many ways, it's a necessity. It's a tricky relationship we have to it now. But if we want to find this sense of uprightness, I hope at the very least through some of these practices, some of these little breadcrumbs, that I've given you a sense of your capacity to sustain yourself. That is something that cannot be stripped from you. That is something that until you die is available to you. And whether you make use of it or not is something very different. That I don't know. But what I do know is that you have the option. So, are there any questions? I do see one in the chat that I must have missed. In the hourglass exercise we did, in a sense, lowering our center point of gravity. In a way, there's an intention that it's moving downward. It's not in space, dropping downward. But there is that sense that something essential in us is moving in that direction. And physically speaking, when we have that sense of awareness of the downward, there's a sense of levity that results. There's a counter action that takes place. But yeah, good clarification. What else? The grains of sand, can it be used in many different starting positions? Yeah. In any position. Peter, I know you're working on the Stalder press, fancy press up to a handstand from the gymnastic pancake thing. Peter, if you think of the grains of sand in your hands and you pour from the pelvis through the shoulders into the hands, you'll find that your pelvis has a very different relationship to gravity in that case. So yeah, in just about any position, this is something we can make use of. Alex says, working on ankles, especially with a joint restriction, does including whichever max range of motion you have at the moment force the body and nervous system to adapt over time? Occasionally. I won't say it forces it. And the reason is that when we encounter our maximum range of motion, the point where we have muscular tension that puts the brakes on us moving farther, that tension, again, is a protective response. That tension is a means whereby we find security in that shape. So if I crank on my security mechanism, trying to drive my knee past my toes farther, I'm playing a bit of tug of war with myself in some sense. Now, spending time in that shape, say if I'm in the bottom of a squat and I have support coming up from underneath of me, spending time in that shape supported can help take the brakes off of that neurological tension. That's one of the things that can actually remove the need for that sustained muscular engagement. Now, there's a funny thing that happens when I open up a range of motion. Say that I spend 30 seconds, 2 minutes in that sort of supported squat, kind of like I've been doing right now, actually. I have a cushion underneath of the pelvis. My ankles are in that dorsiflex position. If I open up that range of motion, if I just shift myself a little bit toward where I want to be, I can work that range. Now, what I mean is I can contract and counter-contract. I can think of pressing out of the position and pulling actively into the position. Not by wedging myself there, but it's like the front of my shin, in the case of the squat, can pull me forward. And then from the feet, I can push myself backwards. There is nothing happening here except for a movement of my ankles. But it's this movement of the ankles within the supported position. That's what can help me adapt to that shape over time. So, Owen, I see you have a hand raised here.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think how to word the question. Do you kind of exclusively think in the terms of these relationships of these three things, and in terms of movements? Do you ever kind of get into the anatomy and look for almost like a culprit type muscle? It's often I've kind of seen people say, "Oh, if you have this problem and you stretch this muscle, then ta-da." Do you kind of always work through movements and through relationships and through sort of the soma? Do you find anyone that maybe does just have like a specific muscle that needs checking more towards the sort of mechanical view of the body rather than the movement, the pulleys and the levers, rather than kind of the control sensory nervous system? Or do you find that there's a comparison between the two? I'm kind of thinking out loud, so it's kind of a clunky question there.
Sure. Yeah. I think if there were one little switch we could flip and then ta-da, that would be a hell of a trick. I've not come across it. I would love for it to be that simple. Truly, if the biomechanical way of looking at the body worked, that would be such a nice thing for us. It would make so much more sense, so much more frequently. But if there is a part of the body, and this gets us into thinking in terms of systems, if there is something within the ecosystem that is a little out of whack, we're going to find it hitched to many other parts of the ecosystem.
Okay.
So let's say, just as an example, that I have a tight psoas.
Yeah, so this is often the one that's labeled as, that's the one.
Yeah,
right?
or I have a piriformis syndrome. No one seems to ever talk about biceps syndrome. Okay. We always talk about those kind of mysterious ones that we're not very familiar with. But let's say that I have piriformis syndrome or a tight psoas, or my obturator is out of whack. What does that do for me?
So if the piriformis is tight, this is going to externally rotate the feet, and so that's people go, the piriformis is tight. But actually, what you're looking at there is the base of support is kind of penguined almost, isn't it? As if there's a compensation in how you then have to navigate around that tightness. And that's what creates that waddle in the piriformis example.
Yeah. The challenge that I find with that is that inevitably we run into a chicken and egg situation. It's like, well, is it a tight piriformis that brought my feet out? Is it a habitual way that I carried? Dancers very often will carry themselves in a certain way. It's like it's a performative stance because, well, they're performers, yeah. But particularly people with, say, like a ballet background will carry themselves in a certain stance. And then we might wonder, is it the demands of that stance that caused the muscular adaptation, or is it a muscular adaptation that caused the configuration of the skeleton? It's a little bit of both and. But I think the fact that there is the possibility of that question means we've got to think in terms of the relationships between those parts.
Yeah, I like that. The fact that the question exists is almost the answer. Yeah, it's almost like the answer is the question, right?
I think that if we're talking about life, we've got to talk about relationships. Now, if I release and create some length within the psoas, that's going to change the way that I walk. That's going to change the way that I stand. That's going to change all these things. However, if I'm not in a situation where I can learn how to make use of that new range of motion, what does my body do? It responds to the unknown and the threat of injury, and it contracts once again. So I think there's incredible value in the sort of targeted spot treatments of particular tissues, with the caveat that we then have to make use of that window of opportunity. We have to learn how to use that new range of motion, because if we don't learn how to use it, we have a protective response to contract right back into the habits.
I like that. Lovely. Perfect.
Cool. I see Varuni. You have a hand raised?
Hi, hello Chandler. Hello
Hey.
everyone. Were you saying about that 360-degree hanging thing where I was hanging on my son's pull-up bar and moving around? Were you saying that that helps us to find more support of our upper body?
It does. Now, I should probably qualify that too. If I'm hanging and moving around there and I don't seem to have a sense of my feet underneath of me, well, then I'm just collapsing into those tissues. Yeah. So if I'm going through this and I can find that sense of a little bit of lift up and through the feet, but also that traction through the arm, through the upper body, that really can help us develop a more harmonious relationship, let's say, between the upper limbs and the lower limbs.
So how often do you said to practice it for a short period of time every day, you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, you could go through something like 30 seconds after you get up from the computer, or you could do a targeted 5 to 10 minutes. This is one of those things where a little bit done frequently is much more important than saying like, I'm going to hit those shoulders hard. A little bit here and there sprinkled throughout the day, much more effective. But if that's not available, I have many clients I've worked with who, 5 minutes a day, they just set a timer and they move through one side, they move through the other side. Really opens up space through the upper body.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Alex.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay, all right, nice. So, what you said about support and with, I guess, increasing that dorsiflexion capability using support. Let's say that I am able to temporarily remove the joint restriction by using a band or stretching it a bit. Is basically my next goal going to be to sort of put something under my heels and then spend time in that position to kind of establish this security as you mentioned, and or I don't know, or what else would I do?
Yeah, so that related to that floor sitting practice we talked about. It's a sense that if, well, I'll angle downward and we'll have a little look. So if, let's say that this isn't what my squat looks like. Let's say I sink down in my squat and I'm somewhere kind of up here, like the heels don't quite meet the ground. Here we have a gap.
Uh-huh.
Now this gap is where my body, in sort of a physiological sense, gets anxious. This
Okay.
doesn't feel secure because I'm over a very narrow base here. Now, if I can't bring myself to the ground, I can, as you mentioned, bring the ground to myself. And let's say that I
Oh, yeah.
prop up on this. But all of a sudden, you can't quite see up here, but I am much more upright with that sense of support. My posture, my shape within the position is one of support. It's one of uprightness. So if I can't find a connection between a particular part of myself and the ground, if that part of me just won't go to the ground, a really nice rule of thumb is bring the ground up to you.
Okay.
Now that
So-
could be with the bolster, it could be with a block, it could be with, just about whatever in that case.
So let's say that I move my tibia into through the using the band. Let's say I move the tibia and now the tibia is temporarily in a better position. Does it react the same way the muscle does, or does the joint kind of have the same kind of nervous system reaction to where it manages itself in open space and eventually learns to keep space there in the same kind of way?
Yeah, there is an acclimation process to that new range where we've got to think in terms of range of motion. We're dealing with primarily neurological issues. Now, there are soft tissue adhesions and things that can influence this as well, but in terms of usable space, there's a neurological adaptation, a sort of acclimation period, where you will develop a sense of, well, I'll tell you this, okay. Our nervous system is concerned with use, with a functional engagement through the environment. So if you're, you do a banded distraction, you open up a bit of space around the ankle. What you can do is, if you make your way into the squat or a half squat or any of these different shapes, and kneeling, for example, the process that I encourage people to go through is a three-part thing. So within any of these floor sitting positions, even within just sitting in a chair, you make sure first that you can breathe. And not necessarily like a gasping in deep breath, but just, can I exhale fully? And can I inhale with reasonable ease? Now, if I can't, it's a really good sign that my body senses a lack of support. There's a reason I've had to brace and halt myself. So I can pile up some support. I can elevate the pelvis. I can get something under the knees, all of this. So breathe. Then can I orient? Can I look around the room? Can I situate myself? Again, when we're thinking about finding ease in these shapes, it's a matter of our relationship to our surroundings. That's a neurological imperative. So within this squat, can I just look up? Can I look down? And you'll notice as I do this, each of these joints is getting a slightly different mechanical stimulus as well, right? We're actually getting into the mechanical adaptations required. So I take myself here and take myself there. It's a little bit of targeted weight training for the joints, we'll say. Now I can take that another step further. I have breathe, I have orient, and I can reach through space too. I can reach up that way. I can reach from the supported position. If I'm in my squat, I can reach to the right, I can reach back, I can reach way up back there, I can reach over to that side too. Again, each of these is going to ask my joints to find a sense of aliveness within the position, that sense of a functional engagement with my surroundings. Breathe, orient, reach. It's a really reliable framework to open up some space and to retain some space within these shapes. And it capitalizes on the sort of developmental progressions that we go through. If you think about an infant, all they're doing is breathing, looking around, reaching, trying to eat everything around them. Like they're just trying to engage in the space around them. And from that yearning for engagement, they develop all of this capacity to sit, to stand, to walk, to run, to climb on things. It's a really nice thing.
All right, thank you.
Of course, my pleasure. Yeah. Any other questions from today? If, while we're thinking, you're curious what the next steps might be, there are a couple of possible next steps. So let me share my screen for a moment, if I can find the right window. Always nice to have a path, yeah? So if you're curious about what comes next, the Gazette members among you will know that the vault is opening up this month. Actually, February 1st, so Monday, at noon, the vault creaks open. And if you're here at the posture workshop, you actually are able to have first in line access too. It's a collection of basically the greatest hits of all the programs I've developed over the years. Mobility oriented, embodied mindset oriented, helping just figure out how to get unstuck. And it's something where moving forward, I'm throwing everything I develop in there. If you join the vault, you also get roped into the Gazette crew. You'll get a free copy of the Gazette each month, where I write a little more in depth, a little more targeted look at how to think through these problems, and something special for the first 5 people who join. So if you're curious to learn more, you can go to chandlerstevens.com/vault. Not a very creative name, but chandlerstevens.com/vault. I'm putting a discounted rate on it through Sunday night at midnight. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those too by email. But some people like next steps, some people like having a path laid out, and paths laid out there. But for the time being, I do want to make sure that regarding what we've talked about today, that you feel secure with this, that you feel like you have the capacity to take this forward. So if there are lingering doubts or uncertainties, more than happy to. I'll tell you the truth. I'm just hanging out on Zoom, answering questions the rest of the day. The Gazette subscribers, we have a call later the afternoon too, little mini workshop. So I'm just a question answering machine for the time being. Good. Wheels are turning. I'm glad to hear it, Andrea. That's the main thing.
I have a question.
Erica, yeah.
It's kind of my personal body. Like I wrote in the pre-questions, the outside of my thighs from like my hips down halfway, they're almost always cold, and I feel like it's a lack of circulation, possibly based on posture. So I wonder what you have to say about like getting warmth to that part of my body based on posture.
I wonder, since it's your personal body, would you mind coming to stand for a moment? We can take a look at what we see here. And actually, do you mind, Erica, if I spotlight you just so I can see a bigger?
Sure.
Okay.
I don't know if you can see.
Yeah.
All of me.
So this will actually be a nice thing for us. As you stand here, we went through some of those questions at the very beginning about the general lay of the land, right? How upright you feel, what your relationship to support is like, where it feels like gravity is winning. Now, if I can direct your attention to a particular part of this, I wonder, how do your feet seem to meet the ground here? What do you notice when you think about the connection of the feet to the ground?
I feel like the ball of my foot or right under it is connected, and the inside is connected more than the outside.
Ah, okay. So if I were to exaggerate this, is a little bit like that in the feet?
It feels like it. I don't know if it looks like it, but that's what it feels like, yeah.
Okay. So I am much more interested in the feel than the look for the time being. Because when it comes to our individual operating systems, it's that internal sense you have. That's the main thing. So as you stand here, I imagine that relationship of the feet also influences certain things up farther in the chain. If your knees were to tell you anything about your posture here, what would they tell you about this? What do you notice going on at the level of the knees?
Because the feet are kind of going in, the knees kind of feel like they go in. If I move my feet out to where I feel like I'm more fully meeting the ground, it almost feels like my knees open out.
Okay, cool. So you can notice a difference between you can move to the inside edge or the outside edge. Yeah?
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. So if you return to your, let's say, default stance, I wonder, what do you notice at the level of the hips as well?
It feels like my tailbone is going back.
Okay.
Like it feels like I'm going like this.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. So your shoulders also know something about this position too, right? Where do they feel like they're going?
More forward than back.
More forward than back. Okay. So we can see that this relationship of, it's almost like, you know how in a couch cushion, there's a button that holds all of the upholstery in place? That button could be just about anywhere, but it would hold the fabric to the foam. It would give it a sense of structure. And we can think about the relationship of our contact with the ground as a sort of button tie like that. And based on that button tie, the whole structure can be totally different. So I'll have you do a funny thing here. You mentioned that you can shift your weight to the outside of the foot, right?
Uh-huh.
So when you do that, is it a sense of something like this? It's like you come onto the outside blade of the foot a bit more, or do you do something a little different?
It just feels more flat.
Or flat? Okay.
But
And
it's like I put more weight on the outside, but
Mhm.
then the weight actually feels more like distributed evenly.
okay. Okay. So I wonder, now that we notice what's happening, if we can get a little more granular in terms of how it's taking place. As I mentioned, if we know what's going on and how it's occurring, that gives us a really clear opportunity. So there's a shift that I'll see if we can find here. If you look down at your feet, you can see the big toe joint, right? That knobby part where the big toe connects to the foot.
Uh-huh.
For the anatomy nerds, we have our first metatarsal phalangeal joint. Yeah. Now, I'd like you to glue that point to the floor. Just imagine that it's not going to leave the floor.
Okay.
And likewise with your heel, could you glue your heel to the floor?
Okay.
Now, there's a funny thing I'll ask you to do. Keeping those 2 points glued, the heel and that big toe joint,
Uh-huh.
can you imagine lifting the inside arch of the foot up
Okay.
away from the ground?
Yep.
Now, what do you notice happening? Talk me through a little bit about what you sense here.
I feel like the other 4 toes connected more to the earth.
Okay.
More of the weight went to the outside of my foot. And less tension on the arch.
Okay. Now, when I go through this practice myself, I think of, it's a bizarre image, but it's the one that I've got. It's like a jellyfish trying to open a doorknob. So I get a movement like this in the foot, and then
Mhm.
also a little bit of a rotation in the foot.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I imagine this sort of pulling in a spiral up and through the leg, up and through the pelvis, up and through the spine, coming from both sides here. Now, does that change anything about the sense of what you notice around the knees, around the hips, around the shoulders?
I can feel like a weakness because that part of the, like as I move that part of my foot and it ripples up, it feels like everything kind of opens more. But then I also feel a weakness because hasn't been the natural state of my body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're asking those muscles to work in a very different way.
Yeah.
Now, you could let that go. You could settle back into the habit here, right?
Uh-huh.
Could a few times you move back and forth between those two? So you think about that sense of lift up and through the inside edge of the foot, and then you release back into the habit, and you just move back and forth here until you can find the sort of the sweet spot in between where you could do either as easily as the other. It's like you could pause and you could go this way and you could go that way. But this is how we can start to develop that familiarity with this new arrangement of your bones, this new demand for tension through the muscles. Now, when you find a sense of that lift up and through you, could you take a little walk through the room? And you don't have to hold that sense of lift, but could you maintain the intention of that sense of lift as you take a little walk through the room? And then would you take a few steps sort of falling back into the habit? So you let go of that lift and notice what's different about the way you walk. And as you continue stepping through the room, it's almost like you could turn the dial up and find that sense of lift. You could turn the dial down and go back into the habit. But what we're looking to do is develop a familiarity with this new pattern of organization and teach the body what this is for, where it could be useful. Because if we can demonstrate a sense of use, we're much more likely to retain those changes. Our body really likes ease.
It's very different
Yeah.
to like go back and forth and notice the difference.
Mhm.
How, like with sticking those two parts to the ground and lifting the middle part or the arch, it feels like the whole body, like the knees open, hips, pelvis opens, shoulders kind of drop.
Mhm.
Yeah. And then going back, like everything goes back to like kind of that collapsed
Yeah.
almost.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
this is something you might just keep it in your back pocket. And if you're curious to practice through the day, you might think, when I get up from a chair, am I lifting up and through my legs? Or am I kind of coming forward over my legs and having to push myself up that way?
Yeah.
As you walk from, the bed to the kitchen to make the coffee in the morning, do you have feet underneath of you supporting you?
Uh-huh.
Because the other really interesting thing, and what I wonder about that coldness you mentioned,
Uh-huh.
is when you go back into the habit for a moment, how wide is your sense of support underneath of you?
And smaller.
Yeah, it kind of comes in that way. And then if you find that sense of lift up and through, that broadens the base a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this broader base is another really nice way we can tap into that sense of support relative to gravity. So
Yeah.
that's something that I would encourage you to play with, not to make like a big drill of or a routine of anything like that, but you can explore that, and in that exploration, your body can start to learn a little bit more about how that position works.
Yeah. Thank you.
Of course. My pleasure. Good question. Do we have anything else? I see, Alex, did you re-raise your hand? Sometimes Zoom is tricky.
Yeah, I re-raised my hand. So this question is kind of about doing the squat with support again. So this is like, so when I go into it and I notice after maybe, let's say 2 minutes, I will start to feel knee pains and all that. If I do it frequently and then notice when the knee pains start to come, should eventually, as a trend, should I realize that it takes longer and longer for those knee pains to eventually occur until they eventually stop occurring?
I would look at it more as it's a message from the body that something needs to change. I am hard pressed to think of a situation where I would need to maintain a squat past the point of pain. But if there is that signal of knee pain, what's the body telling you? It's telling you, hey, there might be a risk of tissue damage here. So if you're in that position and the body is sending those little signals of we need to get the hell out of here, that's a good opportunity just to change position. Now you're a young guy, right? There will be plenty of time to come back into the squat later. But for that time being, you may actually just need to move the joints and get blood flowing through the area. There's on a cellular level, there's a metabolic process we need to take into account too. And quite often, if I'm hunkered in a position for a good amount of time and I start to get pain or numbness or my leg falls asleep, I'm choking off the fluid transfer of those cells. They're quite often, that pain around the knees is like a screaming for oxygen of those cells. It's a sense that maybe we have a localized lactic acid buildup. It's a sense that maybe there's a deficit of oxygen. It's, at the end of the day, it's a signal the body sends that says, I got to freaking move. I've got to change positions somehow. So you could see what's the smallest amount of change that counts. You know, if I'm in a squat here and I sense my ankle's not really happy, what's it like to come back to here? I'm still generally in the shape. And I could move into it more on this side and let this side ease up. And then gradually I could come back into the squat over the ankle on this side. But I would not look at the worth of a squat as how long you could remain static within the squat. I would look at the worth of a squat as how much can I do within this position, and with how much ease can I move in and out of the position. That, in terms of a longevity practice, is going to be much more important for us. There are, coincidentally, a number of studies on people who habitually, culturally spend a lot more time in squats. And there are incredible rates of osteoporosis and osteoarthritis around the joints of the knees. There's a lot of time spent fixed within that position. And as a result, the body can develop an inflammatory response around those joints. And that's not so good for us moving well until we die. So I would think if you get that signal, it's a fine opportunity just to get in the dialogue with the body and say, all right, we'll ease up there for the time being. I can come back later. And then I might need to ease up again. But that in and out, similar to what we just worked through with Erica, it's that regaining of the position, that coming in, coming out, that's far more important for us in terms of a neurological perspective and frankly, a joint health perspective too.
So it's kind of just like telling the body, hey, I need to use this, but right now it's not used to doing it, pretty much.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's telling the body, like, I want this. Okay, you don't seem to want this right now. We need to enter into a compromise of sorts.
Yeah, so then you would go on and off with it until eventually you don't really need to go out of it as frequently anymore, I guess.
Yeah. You'll start to open up that range of motion, and there
Okay.
will be less of a need for the body to signal the potential for tissue damage in that case, because that's what pain is in that case.
What would you say is like I guess the amount of time per day that you should spend in that, or is that based on just the individual? How?
That's going to depend based on the individual. Yeah.
Okay.
Generally speaking, all of us could spend more time in more varied shapes more often. I do find there's something in movement culture, the general movement culture, where there's sort of fetishizing over certain shapes. Like, I got to get the handstand and it's got to be 60 seconds in a perfect line, or else my worth as a human is nothing. Or I've got to have the flat-footed squat for a certain amount of time, or else, oh God, my whole sense of self is going to unravel. It's like we forget that the movement is the first word of movement culture. It's like, I got to move in, I got to move out, I got to be here, I got to be there. I need to be responsive to my environment rather than a statue within it. Most of us don't have the aesthetic performative demands for something like a perfect line handstand, or any of the sort of artistic performative shapes we might think. So it's a question of individual priorities. There's a lot we can get from having a sort of perfect aesthetic of a shape. But if you ask any performative artist, there are a lot of consequences to those things as well. Ballerinas, beautiful to watch, but man, they don't have pretty feet. And they age painfully. So there are trade-offs, and some of us are willing to make certain sacrifices, and others of us not so much. So I think it depends.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Stephanie asks, dialogue with the body or with the psyche? Oh boy, that's tricky territory. When I put those rings of environment and soma and psyche, they're arbitrary distinctions, right? I mean, there's not a clean, defined boundary between any of those things. We might think that psyche is fundamentally embodied, and our embodiment is fundamentally psychological. in many ways. And then, of course, I don't exist devoid of the environment. I mean, body and psyche, and shaped by the. So it's a dialoguing with and between, and I mean, it sounds like flowery language, but there is, for the scientifically minded, there is more and more evidence supporting what's often called flowery language with these things. A guy to look into if you're curious about that. A couple of guys, actually. One is David Bohm. He writes a lot about our tendency toward fragmentation in our thinking and the challenge that language brings up. A good book there is Wholeness and the Implicate Order. And then my intellectual hero of heroes, half of the people are just going to roll their eyes again with Gregory Bateson. Yes, again with Gregory Bateson. Steps to an Ecology of Mind. And Owen's got the much more digestible Mind and Nature. That's a really good one too. Yeah, Steps to an Ecology of Mind talks a lot in many different ways about these breaks that we're just used to thinking between the psychological, the physical, the ecological. For the movement as metaphor training, we have many of our members here, and I joked with them at the start. I was thinking about making this just a study of this book for the year. You know, we're working together for the year twice a week, and we could probably make do with that and not even finish the thing. But yeah. Well, if there are other questions, I'm happy to answer them. I do want to say as well, just thrilled and appreciative for all of you here. I mean, this is a lot of time and energy and attention that you've directed this way, and it is meaningful for me. Agnieszka, yeah.
Yeah, I have a question, but I'm pretty nervous because there are a lot of people here, and I do not normally participate in meetings like that. So, but it's a funny thing. I'm a teacher, and these days I teach online, and it's not a problem for me. But when I meet so many new people, it's a bit I get a bit nervous, so I need to adapt. So,
Can I pause you for a moment?
Yeah.
Where is your sense of connection to the ground? Even as you describe this nervousness, where did your base go? Where did you lose yourself there in describing this habitual situation?
Well, what happens to me when I get nervous is I get really hot. And this is what I feel first. I probably disconnect completely with my body in terms of connection to the ground. But what I feel is I feel a lot of heat in my head, which goes then down to my shoulders. And then I kind of start feeling sweaty, though I'm not. So if I touch my forehead right now, it's not going to be like sweaty too much, but I can feel a lot of heat as if I was going to burn, you know, something like that. And then it goes down slowly. So when I calm down, then I can feel only the heat in my shoulders.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's take a moment to pause. And if you think through those grains of sand again, because there's a way that we can get very accustomed to our story, to our history, to our habitual means of engaging in the world. And I pause this not to make a big example of it, but just to say that there is a moment where we can interrupt that, where our history doesn't need to perpetuate itself through us. And you've got all the time in the world for the time being. There's not a whole lot riding on this in this case. But if you pause and you wait, you can begin to sense when you are caught up, when you're moved through, when you're on, and the insecurity of our histories takes over. But whenever you feel that sense of base, and maybe without losing that sense of it, then I would love to hear whatever the question is with all of this.
Okay. So last year, when I started teaching online, and I move a lot normally because I go for a lot of walks with my dog. I hike, I train, but I was used to being also very active at work, working with kids. But then in March, when they closed the schools and we were forced to stay at home and in front of the computers, and I found myself spending a lot of time preparing classes, much more time than I used to before, I started exploring different ways of working on the computer because it was really new to me. So this is when I started sitting on the floor. And at the very beginning, as you said, it was very uncomfortable. I got used to it. And then I stopped for 2 months because we had holidays. And then when we came back to school, and we were teaching only for 1 month live, and then we had to go back to teaching online again. I went back to working on the computer, sitting on my floor. And then I started feeling pain in my shoulder. So I went back to the desk for a while, and I stopped feeling the pain. Then the pain came back. So I shifted to the floor again. And I keep on moving from my desk, the kitchen table, and the floor. And I keep on finding myself stopping doing that only because of the pain in my right shoulder. And I have no idea why it's happening. I started observing myself, and I noticed that I tend to lift my shoulders up when I type. So I try to catch myself doing that and maybe shift the position so I don't do it anymore. And I don't strain my right shoulder that much, but still, I'm kind of moving in circles right now, and I'm not sure what's happening exactly.
Yeah. This circling tendency is an interesting thing we can keep an eye out for, because there's an idea of like, well, what are we circling around here? And we might be circling around the very painful truth of the situation that our modern work environment sucks. It is profoundly anti-biological, the situation that we're in. We are running into the clash of culture and biology. And this is a really tragic thing for us. Like the need to work, the imposition on our ability to work, the confinement to one place, these are damning things for us right now. So part of what you're experiencing is a rebellion to the unfortunate reality that we're in. And I get it. Mm-hmm. It's awful. I feel like a cooped up crazy monkey. And the coffee doesn't help sometimes, but helps other times. Now, there is a short-term situation here as well. When we are experiencing this musculoskeletal woe, tension, pain, all of this, again and again, we can think of it as a signal. There's a signal that something must change. Now, that could be a change in shape. That could be a change in position. That could be a change in my environment. That could be a change in, oh my God, a change in the world. Please, I need a change in the world. But okay, I can't hold my breath for that, so I can change my shape in the meantime. I would be very curious. You mentioned there's a tendency for your shoulders to come a little up when you're typing, when you're at the computer.
When I'm really concentrated on something, that's what I do.
Mm.
I find myself in this position when I kind of get too concentrated on something, or I get stuck on something, or when I'm really into something, because sometimes I find myself in this position when I'm like, oh, I've got a brilliant idea, for breathing lesson for my kids, and then I start doing it, and then after 10 or 15 minutes I'm like, oh, this is so great, this is so great, and I'm like, super tense, super excited, but this is what I look like then. My boyfriend even films me and then sends it to me and he's like, do something with yourself, relax.
Yeah. So this, it's a little abstract perhaps, but I think you could make a study of how you respond to excitement and how you respond to focus. Because you mentioned when you get this like really interesting idea, it's like, oh, whoa, this starts to happen. So if possible, when you get that flash of an idea, there's a chance, there's a way that you could just carry on and get excited about it. But there's a chance to watch that mounting excitement come up through you. There's a chance to see what muscular engagements you're making unconsciously and to possibly interrupt that, possibly just inhibit that contraction. And I would wonder what happens in that moment where you are excited about the thing, but you inhibit the muscular contraction that's associated with that excitement, because that's an affect, and our affects are they're played through this muscular engagement. So this might be a weird study you make of yourself, but if you are excited and you get an idea and you take a moment just to say, wait, and you pause, and it'll likely feel like a kind of excruciating pause because you want to get up here, and I get that too.
Do you think it could be connected to the fact that sometimes I'm worried that someone might be first with it and then take it away from me? Or maybe, so because I do get that feeling that I need to put it down fast, otherwise it will be taken away from me. Not maybe by someone else precisely, but sometimes it might be because I might forget, or it might be like sometimes I get worried that when I put it down, maybe if I don't put it down fast enough, then I might not find it that great later on. I don't know.
So there we have that anxiety, right? What do we do when we're hurt? What do we do when we're anxious? You said, do you think it could be a part of that? I think you've conjured that into the room, yeah? So there's probably something to that. The sense of what happens if I lose this idea? What happens if I don't grab this? What happens if I can't get a handle on this thing? What then? And there's not an easy answer to that, but there is the opportunity to investigate that.
Yeah, so that could be a great practice. I could stop myself, especially with the excitement, and then maybe sometimes observe what happens if I don't put it down immediately.
Yeah.
And then see what happens next, and then maybe explore different situations and different scenarios of the thing. Okay, that sounds great.
And I'm willing to bet it's not so much of a doomsday scenario as that part of you thinks it to be. Because there's a part that says like, oh, if I don't get this down, someone's gonna get it. Oh, geez, what's gonna happen then? They're gonna laugh at me. I'm not gonna have the thing. There's a little part of ourselves that can get really wrapped up in that. And that does have all of these hellfire and brimstone scenarios play out. For good reason, right? Like that's a part that's a really worthwhile thing to be able to tap into, but to have that run us entirely is challenging. But I would make a study of it for a week, couple of weeks. That moment when we notice our habit and can interrupt our habit, if we can inhibit our habit, there's a profound place of creative reorganization for us. New behavior, new musculoskeletal alignment, that moment, everything is riding on. Not to raise the stakes too much, but it's a very sweet spot for us.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks for bringing that up.
Thanks.
Anything else for the morning, for the evening, for the afternoon, wherever you are? Well, I say we call it a wrap in that case. Again, thank you all. This is a truly marvelous thing that you're spending a Saturday. I mean, a Saturday on the computer. You could be watching cartoons, but you're here. I do appreciate that. If you are interested, would love to see you in the vault, chandlerstevens.com/vault. It's going to be good stuff. If other questions ripple out after the fact, feel free to email me as well. And as I mentioned, I will get the recording out as soon as Zoom has it processed for us. So keep your eyes peeled, and we'll talk again soon. Take care, everyone.